Hello, and wait, let me do that again because I don't like to lead up. Hello, and welcome to episode 42 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Today, we're going to chat about the hits that we're going to be posting to Mechanical Turk in order to solicit feedback for the second product. We need to kind of finalize those because we have to go through the IRB process, and the application's basically ready to go, except they're going to need to see those hits in order to see, what we're asking. So we've got to finalize those. And as I mentioned previously, it kind of asks a question I think we need to talk through because it asks, literally what's going to go on those hits, but that sort of speaks to a couple of broader concerns. One of them, and kind of the main one, is what are we trying to find out, right? It seems a little rudimentary, but the hits aren't finalized yet. So the issue is, like, what research question are we addressing through these hits? That's kind of one main thing. Another main thing that came up is in our reading, we read some additional material. In particular, I think we were looking at the piece Being a Turker, which is they call it a ethno-methodological piece, I believe, right?
I think that's, I've got it right here.
Yeah, as do I. Let's see. Yeah, ethno-methodological study. So it raises some interesting questions about Turkers, and this came up with Kegel as well. I mean, the strange notion of, in what ways do you respect or provide dignity to your research, even the language you choose, participants or subjects. So this piece is kind of interesting because it does sort of foreground some things that are relevant to Turkers as a research population. And so part of that's going to filter into the language of our hits, right? How do we do things that are, in terms of rhetoric, sort of suiting our audience in terms of their expectations, right? And pragmatically, that means things like making sure the hit is clearly written, which is something we're potentially studying. I mean, that's why we're changing some of the language, although this does underscore, we shouldn't change instructional language because that could just be screwing with them, right? I mean, it's like, this is a job where you want to just clearly do what you want to, just to receive your compensation. The same way, any job, you probably wouldn't be too thrilled if, they were, I'm going to give you two different ways to explain to you how to do your job and then see what happens. It's like, just let me do it. So, I mean, that's part of the study. And one of the ways we're mitigating that is we're not tinkering with the instructional language. We're just looking at the title and description. But, how do you, provide sufficient information without wasting their time, but also sort of, how do you suit the audience, I guess, is part of it. And also, without being patronizing, it's just sort of it's a rhetorical challenge in certain ways.
Well, yeah, because that's what really came out of that being a Turker piece is a real, at least from the Turkers things that they shared, right? A real kind of allergy to a certain kind of paternalism.
Yes.
that might creep in, oddly enough, if you're coming in from the academic side and you're trying not to exploit them or things like that, right? Weirdly enough, they don't necessarily respond well to that because they potentially see that as an impingement upon the labor market that they see themselves as a part of.
Yes, and we've actually encountered that, previously. The idea of, and in that piece, they're just sort of like literal quotations of, Turker's not super happy with journalism and academic research that potentially paints the service in a bad light, or that, is calling for things like regulation. I mean, that was a good point in terms of like, um, uh, journalism and research perhaps suggesting the value of regulating that market to prevent abuses, but then the participants in that market, in some ways being resistant to that because the potential is it could just be shut down, it could just go away, right? And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It'll drive away all the requesters.
well, or Amazon could just straight up pull the plug. I mean, that's something I've seen discussed on other spaces like Reddit, where they say, is there any push towards unionization? Because like in the first piece, and this is certainly relevant right now, Amazon is resistant to unionization of other workers, like its own warehouse workers. I think it's fair to say Amazon is resistant to that. I don't think that's a controversial statement in the slightest. And then they are resisting it explicitly in a lot of ways. Now, Turkers are not really Amazon employees. Neither are they employees of the requesters. And so, there'll be occasionally sort of like conversations that you'll see about collective action on MTurk, or some form of unionization such that, pay is regulated and conditions are maybe a little better. But the sort of common response is, and it's not always aggressive, but it's just sort of like, but Amazon could just turn off the key at any moment, could just take this away. And we have literally no protection. And if you're dependent on this, for part or all of your income or whatever, it's like, don't mess with it, right?
Yeah, no, it's a real exercise in what precarity does.
Which is, I don't think something that's going to be a main focus of the second piece, right? I mean, that's like, and I mean, the piece we're reading about being a Turker is semi-conscious of some of these things, in that it points out, it says pretty clearly, we are part of the research that this group does not like. And, we've also heard that feedback from other quarters before, that it's like what the body understandably doesn't like research that's just kind of, in this case, it presents itself as ethnology, or, an ethnography, right? Which means sort of what was going on there is lurking in certain ways and then reporting back. And, the body itself is potentially, you don't want to just say they act as a body, because they don't. It's a bunch of individuals, but there is at least some discussion about, that not being super okay. I mean, think of it in other situations where it's like, I'm doing an ethnography, but I'm not telling the people. So I'm just kind of like palling around with them and then reporting back. And it's like, I mean, that is in some ways common ethnography process, but it also does sort of raise questions about consent, right? And so we've been discussing this. I mean, like for us, since we're not doing that, we're posting hits. It's like, we're not violating the contract, which is, we're going to give you a clear hit and pay you for it in ways that, at least as far as we can tell, are appropriate, right? That are well within guidelines for MTurk use for research. And there are such guidelines provided that say, here's compensation rates. Ours are well in excess of that. Here's, clarity in terms of don't waste people's time, right? This is sort of time focused, so don't waste their time. Be clear about what your expectations are. I think we're doing that, but we need to talk about it today, including aspects such as, since we're asking for things like, summaries, like write a summary of this, do we need to be explicit that all good faith attempts are acceptable and we're not looking for a correct answer? Because sometimes hits can be rejected because people didn't provide what the requester sees as to be an appropriate response. So if there's a right answer, for example, and this comes up, like, let's say you're doing something where you're doing like audio transcription, right? And so there is a correct answer, or a correct-ish answer. And if someone gives you something that's way off, requesters was within their rights to say, well, no, I'm not going to compensate you for this because either you did a poor job or you're a bot and you're just putting in gibberish, and I'm not going to compensate that. That came up in the study we read, that sometimes people were believed to be bots, something we've talked about a lot. So
Yeah.
their labor was rejected because the person thought they were a bot or a scammer just putting in random stuff, right? So, I mean, all of these are relevant issues, right? And I think what it means in terms of brass tacks is a couple of things. One, we need to resolve what our HIT is asking for, cognitively because of our research, to make sure the questions are in line with the research question we're seeking to address. That also plays out in terms of clarity in the HIT, in terms of this is what we'd like you to do, and we don't want to waste your time. I mean, it's something we talked about with Kagel as well, is, and this is something that's come up for me. It's like, if I'm asking for something, it should have some value. Otherwise, it's just like, I'm asking you to do something that I'm going to throw in the garbage.
Right.
And that's come up for me in particular in one or two places because of things like, there is some feedback I'd like at a certain point in the study, but one of the main reasons why I'd like it is because it would help ensure that a Turker is filling this out rather than a bot or a scammer. In some sense, it's like asking them to provide a sentence is a check that helps ensure you're not only a person, but a person who can read and understand English, because some of the questions are multiple choice questions. So if there's no wrong answer, you could just pop in whatever you want, but they're questions that depend on your ability to comprehend stuff, like a video or a paragraph of text. And so you could be a human, but a human who doesn't read English and is still popping in responses, right? But if you're asked for a sentence, like, why did you give this rating? There's a sense in which there's a check there. And that's part of the value. And, I'm a little of two minds about that as a check. It's like, as a requester, I'm within my right to make sure this is a valuable response. But what am I doing with that sentence? I do kind of want that sentence, but it's also at a point in the survey where it's at scale. So like, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to read each one of them. I could potentially put all those sentences into, a text processor and pop out sort of main terms. That's certainly something I could do, or we could do. So, there's just these kind of lines, as is the case at every moment in this study, in this project, this entire project. There's all these entanglements of ethics and how they play out in documents and research and this kind of thing. And so, we were once again called to address these with imperfect information, to kind of grope along here with what's the best way to go.
Well, and that was sort of what the kind of question that I've been thinking about too, particularly after that being a Turker piece. And I even just wrote it across the top of it, right? That how do we engage this, because there's also the second part of that question, which is how do we sort of responsibly engage Turkers? But we have to do that within MTurk.
Mm-hmm.
So there's it's not as simple a question of how do we sort of ethically engage Turkers, because we have to do it in a particular platform that already has in it ethical assumptions about how one, right? So for the Turker piece, right, being able to spot scammers is a part of the ethics of MTurk.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense in which if we're asking them to give us a sentence that we're not going to use, potentially there's an issue there, but that's also itself a kind of control within
Mm-hmm.
the system. So there's, any procedure we develop for what we think is an ethical way of working with Turkers, we have to do that within MTurk.
Right.
And so that might lead us to do things that make sense in the context of Mechanical Turks, but not if we were doing some other kind of questionnaire with people.
Yeah.
Like where, you wouldn't, if we were doing just an outside Turks sociological study, we wouldn't necessarily have a bunch of questions where people are essentially asked to
Right.
their humanity.
Yeah.
But within Turk, that seems to be a perfectly acceptable practice that's desired by both requesters and Turkers.
Well, and a couple of things that there are such guidelines. We serve a few different sort of constituencies in that, one thing that Peace pointed out and that we've already received feedback on is there are such guidelines. And, so there are ways to do this in terms of things like, well, don't waste their time and pay them fairly and be clear. It's like, okay, well, that makes sense. And be receptive to commentary, right? If someone has questions, that was something that Peace pointed out is the nature of relationship. For us, it'd be a little different in that these wouldn't be ongoing. So, one thing that Turkers are kind of interested in is it's like, if I see this requester again, right? I mean, a lot of this feedback is kind of like post facto. And for us, that won't really be much of an issue because it's like we do this and then probably that's it. It's like, we just need some response on this survey and then that's it. So we're serving that constituency, but we're also serving IRB and other research ethics constituencies. But there's also something in this that's come up that particularly in like doing the IRB process is it's not a binary, right? There are sort of questions and negotiations of things like risk. So here's how this becomes practical. It's like we're asking for at most 3 questions and probably, we're talking around a couple of minutes. So in a sense, it's like even if we're asking for a question that is partially a check on, are you a human? It's not an overly onerous burden and there's not a huge risk associated with it. You know what I mean? It's like at most this is going to take you a couple, we're talking like 20 seconds and there's no real risk in the sense of like the main risk is this is delaying your ability to go on to another hit, right? But it's not delaying it so much and the pay is such that it's like you're getting compensation for this. Which, as researchers, we always quail. It's I think we quail at saying like, well, you're getting paid for it, so therefore you should be able to endure anything. But if the risk is material, if the only risk is this is stopping me from taking another job, it's like, but this job is paying you appropriately, then the risk is it slides this way, right? The risk isn't binary. It's this spectrum of checks. It's like at any moment you can walk away from this, right? I mean, that's part of the IRB thing and why that language is there. It's voluntary. You can walk away at any moment and you don't have to even answer this question. Although if you want payment, you have to answer all 3. Maybe it hasn't been approved yet. So we're asking you for a sentence here. You don't have to do it. If you want to get paid, you do. But if you do it, you're still going to get fair value in terms of what's going on here.
Yeah. No, and that struck me too about right, the whole sort of economy that's within Turk does complicate the kind of payment issue. Right. I mean, that sense in which there's a weird way in which IRB's language of consent and being able to walk away whenever you want weirdly maps on to the kind of choice-based language that abounds in the kind of gig economy, right?
Yes.
You don't have to work for Uber. You don't have to complete these hits.
You can set your own schedule. That's, kind of the draw.
But if you want to eat, you better be on here 10 hours a day. There's a weird sense in which that the well I don't even want to say well-meaning, right? An IRB, you can walk away from a study at any moment, and that's very much the case. It doesn't quite feel the same way when you do it in a labor market.
Yeah. Yes.
And again, I don't know if that's resolvable, because in part our study is
this
want to engage Turkers inside MTurk. So we have to be inside MTurk to do it in all the ways one is inside it, right? Not just practically, but socially and economically and ethically in it. So,
well, and it in both sort of the IRB and on this kind of platform, as you point out, there is something to like choice being a kind of God term, right? Where and you see that in MTurk feedback, where it's one of the reasons why in some quarters they're resistant to meddling and oversight is that their exercise of choice is enough of a check on the market, where it's like, if these were just straight up exploitative, we just wouldn't do it. It's like, if there were a point where it's like, well, this just isn't worth it, and everybody kind of reached that point, it's like, well, this wouldn't exist. No one's forcing me to do this. So, if we just don't do it, then it goes away. It's like, I mean, that's how we deal with bad requests, exploitative requests. We just don't do them, and, problem solved. IRB too. I mean, choice is a big thing, where it's, as you say, it's like, if you can walk away, if you don't have to do it, that's a big thing. But, as is the case with any kind of ethical precept, it's like, it doesn't really tell the whole story, because there's possibly no such thing as free choice, right? I mean, yes, I can walk away, but that means I don't get paid, and I'm dependent on pay to survive. So, I mean,
I was interesting because I read that I was finishing my IRB training as that being a Turker piece sort of rolled out, and it was hard to avoid the kind of strange juxtaposition of all the language of autonomy that pervades the IRB training, and the way that, right, in a really ethical way, right, you have to protect their autonomy, and then the way in which a very similar term could be used by Amazon to screw a bunch of people, right? That way in which choice becomes a way of avoiding, you could choose not to drink polluted water, right? So the government shouldn't be in charge of, right? That way in which that language of choice and autonomy can be used in an almost diametrically opposed fashion.
Yeah. And, I mean, related terms like consent are terms that, again, are good terms, like consent to certain things. And I mean, like, as we deal with other ethical issues, the nature of consent becomes crucial, right? I mean, why are some acts permissible? Well, because you have consenting parties. And yet, that itself has, when we say in other contexts, when we talk about that, it's like, well, but we also need things like adults. And, right, I mean, like, you can't give consent if you're not an adult and someone who is capable of giving consent, right? This is a population that isn't capable of giving consent. There's a sort of paternalism in that.
Yeah.
Shoot, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
Well, and there's ways in which consent is, I mean, this was some research I was doing about attention and sound, and led me to do lots of reading in the language around sexual consent.
Right.
Right. Then, but to imagine, I mean, right, weirdly enough, just even etymologically, what we almost mean is assent. Consent is actually an act that individuals don't do. I mean, consent is literally a communal sensing, right? So there's a sense in which any act of individual consent is being constructed, right? So, I mean, the language in around sexual consent is, if you boil consent down to two autonomous individuals, you've already missed a lot of the work that goes into, right, how gender gets constructed in such a ways that consent can already be, right? There's the example I use in my research was the episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where they buy the boat, and and it's Dennis being his at his most sociopathic, right? You get him out on the boat
Right.
and
The implication.
oh, but it's the implication.
Yeah, the implication.
I mean, I'm reading all this Mechanical Turk, right? And of course, they're all free to choose, but there's an implication here that they're literally folded into, right? They're not choosing the implications. And one could imagine a system being constructed in which, of course, you can opt out whenever you want, but we've constructed that the larger consensus around it makes that very difficult. So you can see that tension within that being a Turker piece, where on one side, don't be paternalistic, totally protect our autonomy, because we don't actually have any autonomy. Because at any moment, somebody with more power than me could shut this whole thing off. So weirdly, there's a sense in which, please don't violate my autonomy, because full disclosure, I don't really have much. I am in a very precarious position. So there's a weird sense in which you have individuals wanting to protect their autonomy, but the reason they give you for protecting my autonomy seems to be, I don't have any power in this situation. So don't do anything to rock the boat. Because
well, and something else that came up in that piece was choice and potentially consent also is dependent on information. Right. And that's one of the things that came out of it was the need for more information about scenarios. I mean, that's a good point. It's like, you can't consent to something if you don't know what you're getting into, in the sense of like, if someone comes up to you and says, is it okay if I do this? And you're like, what are you going to, no, is it okay if I do it? But what do you, no. Is it okay if I do it though? It's like, well, what are you talking about? Right. If there's an information vacuum there. And so, the notion of choice assumes a lot, right? I mean, it has, as you say, it has a lot of invisible labor behind it, in terms of you're assuming, this kind of Cartesian rational agent, and one with perfect access to infinite information, which is an impossibility. It's related to like, I was just looking at something about, the onus of being, this came in the wake of the Texas weather issue, right? And this got equated literally by politicians to Katrina, understandably, where it's like we have this giant disaster, and the notion of the burden of information is on the individual. So the people who were victimized by Katrina and in Texas, there's a default assumption, even if not articulated all the time, there's a default assumption of, well, this was your fault. Like, why didn't you watch the news, and then when you saw a hurricane was coming, drive somewhere else? And hidden behind that is like, I don't have access to a car, right? I couldn't go anywhere because I've got nowhere to go. This is my home. I got nowhere to go, right? The same thing's true in Texas, where it's like, why don't you just pick a grid? It's like, we've got one grid here that's controlled by Texas and thoroughly deregulated, where it's like, there's always, whenever something bad happens, it's like, you deserved this in certain ways.
And weirdly, that is perhaps surprisingly, but really not surprisingly, across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Which is the sort of I guess liberal response would be, well, this is what happens when you vote for Republicans. And then someone points out, you're aware of gerrymandering, right?
Yeah.
Like, well, then this is either your fault because you should have gotten a better electrical grid or bought a generator, or it's your fault because you voted for Republicans. Both ignore the fact that I pick candidates based on the ballot I'm given and the district I'm drawn into.
Yeah, which language is also used as a cudgel. For example, in the first Trump election, where people were blamed for not voting for Clinton, for voting for like the Green Party, it's like, you made a dumb choice because we only had two real candidates. So your choice, I mean, it's like, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's like, I can only vote for whom I'm presented, but you're also culpable for thinking beyond that. And, the interesting thing is the response politically is different, but the assumption that you are culpable is the same, right? Because the response potentially from the left is, well, then we need larger state to protect people. We need greater regulation. This shows why we need to protect people, because people are vulnerable. The right's response is, no, people aren't vulnerable. They're rugged individuals who can make free choice. But underscoring both of those is you're responsible for this. It's just a different response to it. It's like, well, that's why you need protection. No, that's why you're a rugged individual. But no one's questioning the individual's culpability and responsibility for all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's the horizon of Western like that's, I mean,
yes, that is Western civilization.
Yeah.
Anywho, so in terms of how this plays out in the language of hits, I mean, what I wanted to, and we're half an hour in, we need to look at the actual hits.
Yeah.
And address some of these. Let me just pull this up. Address some of these issues here. You're seeing this, right?
Yes, sir.
So like in writing up the IRB thing, just to clarify, we've got the 2 rounds as structured. We've got the 2 rounds basically, right? And in the first round, what's happening here is people are going to be given, Turkers are going to be given one of 4 pieces of media. That media is now produced, right? They're 20 seconds long. So we've got a 20-second long video clip, and that's kind of the source material, because from that, there's 20 seconds of audio that's just basically extracted from that video clip. There is an image that is a still, and then there is a textual description. That media is available. I tweaked some of what you provided in part because, as I pointed out, there were immediate typos immediately in the first couple of words where it said roll mop dusting. And I was like, are you talking about a roll top desk?
Yeah, it wasn't even, I didn't get the desk right, and I managed to make it a gerund at the same time.
Anywho, so there's one of 4 pieces of media. You're provided with that, and it's asking you to give a 1-sentence summary of that piece of media. And then it's going to ask you 2 questions about the instructions and how clear they are. And then a question about the fairness of your compensation for this. So that's it. 3 questions. One is asking you for a sentence of summary about a piece of media, and then a question about the fairness, or excuse me, the clarity of the instructions, and then the fairness of the compensation. So that's round 1. Round 2 essentially asks you to select from 4 choices a sentence of summary that coheres with a piece of media you've provided, that's been provided. This is the same 4 pieces of media, and the summaries from which you choose are the ones generated in that first round. Then you've got the same 2 questions asking clarity, a rating of clarity, and then a sentence of explanation, and then a rating of fairness of compensation and a sentence of explanation. So those questions 2 and 3 are identical in both rounds. Question 1 is different. In round 1, you are generating a sentence of summary. In round 2, you are picking one of those sentences as fitting one of 3 terms as is currently written. Those 3 terms are accurate, readable, or relevant. So one of the reasons why it's framed in those terms is because those 3 terms emerged in our first product, and we're seeing if those are synonyms or if those are different, right? Is there a difference between accuracy, readableness, readability, I guess I should say. I'm trying to think what's the appropriate adjective here. Well, whatever. And relevance. Yeah, so that's how things are structured. Now, okay, so my large scale question to you is this. Are these the right hits? Are these the right tasks to ask this subject pool for what we want to examine in the second piece here?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, it's the direction that we've been heading. I mean, And there's also a sense in which, I mean, I think, well, or to not answer your question and ask a different question, although this is going to sound more mercenary, but I don't mean it that way.
Yeah, go ahead. I have my own problems with this.
Do we think that these hits will generate something that we can then talk about? I think there should be a expectation that we're likely to be surprised by the results. So in other words, is asking the question, will we get what we want from these hits? Maybe the better question is, will we get something usable from these hits?
I think definitely we will, although my frame for that is we will definitely get results from this process. We definitely will. There will be results. The larger, seemingly necessary question in the humanities appears to be, well, are those results exciting?
And if we give the answer we want to give, which is, well, that's our problem writing the second piece. We have to make it wow you. And then, of course, then scientists are like, well, you can't do that either. So,
well, here's the thing. I mean, it's like, I bring this up in part, and part of the reason why I'm wrestling with this is if we're talking about this theoretical framework that involves legibility, visibility and legibility, there's a big spine here of visibility and its relationship to legibility and how that plays out with a framework of literacy. So we've talked a bit about framing this. And I think we talked about this book before, right? This book, Seeing Like a State, which I think I showed you last episode.
Yeah.
And there's some work also in looking at the concepts in this book, which is older in the sense of, let's see, when was it published? 1998, I believe. So, older in the sense of being 20 plus years, not older in the sense of being, several hundred years, which is sometimes what we're looking at. We're working on the century scale here.
Or that's one of my favorite, I forget I think something I had in QJS, which I think is APA, but there was a whole section where I was giving like a rhetorical history and having to put Cicero, Quintilian, right. William James in APA is like James 1904. It's right. Like APA was not built for this.
Right, because a citation system is an epistemology. It's it's not just, I put it in this format. It's here's how you make knowledge, and recency is a big deal. And we're in APA. Recency is a big deal, whereas in MLA, ethos is a big deal. Who said what where? Time is less relevant. The weirder thing in APA is when it's like it's an addition. So you've got Homer, 1987. And you're like, well, yeah, no. I mean. And in that case, it's like it's doing the opposite of the job it's intending to do, right? Because the whole job of that is to point out when it happened, and it's like, well, this is Homer, so
yeah. And 87 is that's both too new and not old and not new enough. Like 87 is the worst possible. That's right. Homer's been dead for a long time, and it's still not up to date.
Yeah. Anywho.
Yeah.
So anywho. I mean, in a sense, it's like it's possible. What's interesting about this is this. I mean, the way I'm leaning is this sort of broader narrative. What's exciting about it, what the wow factor is potentially, is the ways in which the Turk is performing a kind of literacy in which the Turker, right, the base unit of literacy in this scenario is the human intelligence task. Right? That's the base unit. If in orality, the base unit of information circulation is the word, the spoken word, maybe a division of that, like the morpheme, the smallest unit of semantic meaning in orality, however you want to parse that. You can fight about what that is, but, at least it's within a spectrum of there's a base unit there. If the same thing is true in print literacy, right, where we've got the written word, and with these, there are things like larger systemic things, right? Like, so what's the means of circulation in orality, right? It's talking, it's conversation. Plato is big on this, right? Why does he hate writing? It's not because it's writing. It has to do with information circulation, right? that you can talk to a person and that's meaningful. You can't talk to a scroll. It can't answer you back. It's, you know, it's just, at least Plato's Socrates' big problem with it, that it's dumb, literally dumb. It doesn't speak to you. In print culture, it has means of circulation, right? The printing press, the forums in which this takes place. And we've wrestled with this notion of, you know, is our contemporary moment post-literate, right? Have we moved from orality to literacy to, as Ong and Ulmer and lots of other folks talk about, you know, a moment of kind of digitality, or we're not sure what to call it, but something like the digital computer has changed literacy in ways that are comparable, but it's difficult to articulate because we're still within it, so you can't do it retroactively. You know, there's a framework in which we look at this spine of visibility and literacy and say, this is a form of literacy that addresses that question. The human intelligence task, understood broadly, is the base unit of digitality. Humans are no longer principally the system participant that is decrypting the symbol, right? In orality, you are the human is the principal unit because it is the conversational node. In print culture, you are the decryptor of symbols, right? In this form of digitality or post-literate existence, you are still doing those things, right? Just like in a print culture, you don't stop talking, it's still there. It's just you're now in a principally print culture because it starts to dictate cultures of reception, right? Speech begins to become print-like, right? Rules of good grammar, those are based on print conventions, even though they seep into speech, right? So the same is true in digitality. We are still reading, we are still writing summaries, we are still listening to the audio that we are providing, but at a higher, broader level, which maybe is a bad metaphor, but there you go, we are being read. That's what the human intelligence task is to, as we say in the first piece, tell, to make ourselves visible, coherent, intelligible to a broader system, a system that is now deeply invested in digital machines as its means of circulation. So the human intelligence, I mean, if you want a wow claim out of the second piece, that's it. Literacy in a post-digital culture is not human-centered. We act as receptive nodes. The human intelligence task, broadly understood, is the base unit of digitality. We are no longer the principal decoder of symbols. We are the symbols to be decrypted by a higher order of thing.
I think that's, I mean, I just made a note, right? That, you know, as you said before, right? The unit is the hit.
Yes.
I think this gets back to, I think it doesn't resolve the kind of ethical questions we were asking earlier, but I do think it renders them interesting, right? There's a sense in which we've described this second product as being interested in Turkers, but there's a sense in which we aren't.
Yes.
Given what you just said, we're interested in hits, which includes Turkers, but the Turker is not our base unit in this study.
Correct. And it also includes requesters, of which we are too. Yeah. Because part of what we're doing with the hits is doing things like shaping the title and description, because we want to figure out stuff about being a requester, right? Not just a Turker, but a requester. And also one of the things and this is kind of like I was firing off those cryptic messages to you about like the being a Turker thing, is demographic work on Turkers and sociological work on Turkers is fraught, but is also done. It's done, and it's done by social scientists and it's done by economists. There's a sense in which if this piece for us were to be about Turkers and about the experience of Turkers, there's part of me where it's like, that's just going to be half-assed rhetoricians blundering into sociological questions and coming up with poor results about questions that have already been asked.
Yeah.
You know?
You're concerned. It's starting to click now what you're getting at, right? That, and I wonder if it just helps say like this second piece is actually not about Turkers.
No. That work exists, and we're not the people to do it.
Yeah. And given our perspective, if we're really getting at some, not thinking ahead to the third piece, but thinking about some of the other conversations that we've had, right? If we're coming at this from a new materialist or a post-human or a cultural techniques, right? We're not interested in individuals.
Yeah, and okay, and so with this second thing, it's like, and this is why I'm struggling with the hits. It's like, if that's what I'm interested in this second piece, are these questions of literacy, which I think that's a rhetoric concern. It's like, we've been in the first piece, we're starting to, in our revisions, kind of grapple with this. What does rhetoric contribute to this, right? Why are we looking at text in that first piece? Because that is a fair concern of rhetoric. I mean, language is a principal concern of ours, right? Definitely how it ropes into things like agency and ethic and that kind of thing. But certainly language is a big rhetoric thing. In the second one, if we're talking about these questions of like literacy, comprehension, it's like, well, yeah, that's rhetoric stuff. I mean, definitely, it also brushes against linguistics and that kind of stuff, to be sure. But that's under rhetoric's big tent. So I feel more comfortable disciplinary wise. But when it gets to the hits now, and this comes up in the first piece as well, are the hits we are doing right now a good fit for those kinds of issues? Or is it a situation where it's like, this is the big thing I want to talk about. Here's the hits we went through, and I'm not quite sure how those two things actually match up. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do the hits we're asking right now really address those things? Or do they just kind of address those things? Like, okay, the broad theoretical framework I just went off about, how the heck does differentiating between readable and accurate and relevant, how does that factor into that?
I mean, I wonder if it helps. I mean, this might feel like a cop out, but I mean, it's kind of the way that we've pitched the whole project from the beginning, right? We're the sort of exploratory method, right? That we're as much being inventional, right? We're trying to get the kind of sonar analogy that I was thinking about early on, right? We're like pinging it to get a sense of where it's at. I mean, right. And part two, if not part two, TOO, is that it strikes me as, given the way that we're doing the project, that it may be that another value is our oh boy, it sounds like I'm cutting out, but my brain's actually freezing, not my internet. Because of the way that we're approaching this, I don't know if we can know whether or not the methods we've chosen are going to work. And I don't think that's the criteria for this project, which is because we're inventing both at the same time. I mean, I think if we're going to make a big claim for our project, right? If how does rhetoric go about studying this, and rhetoric that's informed by some contemporary theory, if we're trying to get a sense of, if we think the hit is the base unit, then how do you engage in this kind of work that doesn't treat the individual as the base unit?
Yeah.
In terms of the method for doing that, we are as thoroughly grasping at straws as we can, right? I mean, I don't know if we can.
Well,
yeah, I don't know.
Well, and so, I mean, this is kind of, it's like, this is the big ask. I mean, this is the existential thing, is like, I was thinking of, as I was doing this, I was more getting my arms around like a potential sort of framework, right? Because we were talking about that book, we were talking about Casey's material about citizenship and how that may align with these kinds of things as well, where Casey Boyle is looking at those kinds of questions. But I was also like, okay, but how then is what we're asking to do map to this, right? And I was more confident in kind of that first order thing of asking people to summarize work, because in that case it's like, but that is grappling with those questions of literacy, comprehension, readability that come out of the first one that are still very invested in this second thing. This question of knowing, right? It's not only a human concern of, hey, can you watch this video and tell me what's going on? But there's potentially a higher order in which that is collated into, well, based on what all the humans say, this is what's going on. So there was part of me where it's like, I feel more confident in that first act. And it sort of spoke to, well, then should the second part be the manifestation of that, which is where we get all the Turkers to sift through those things and say, well, this is what's going on. And according to us and the machine in concert, this is what that thing is, right? There's a sense in which it's like, given the framework I was thinking about, and you know, we were kind of looking at, would a better way to approach the hit be to do basically what's going on in the first one, but then in the second one, you really just strip it down to, instead of looking at kind of these different permutations, it's just like, which one of these is best, basically, you know? There's 4 pieces of media, which summary here is best? And that's it, basically. It's like, you are the scale. Is it meaningful to try and scratch at those 3 differentiating terms? There was a sense in which, particularly that aspect, that I was like, does that really fit the kind of questions we're asking, or are we just doing it because it sort of emerged in the first piece that those were sites? I mean, part of me was like, is what we should do is just take that sort of one that was most relevant in the first piece, which was readability, because readability was such a complex thing. It had to do not only with like readable text, but seemingly had to do with other weird things like, you know, the boundaries of an object, right? I mean, that's potentially a readable thing. A scenario like the video we have, readability factors into what's the relationship of those 2 people, what's going on there, right? I mean, you remember the struggle we were having in terms of writing up the description for that. It's like, should that be just an observational description, right? You know, a short, seemingly male human sits at a roll mop dusking. Well, you know, I mean, it's like, should it be description or should it be creative? You know, what we call creative writing. And the part of that was a question of readability. A part of that is like, how do you describe a scenario without making choices related to, is this analytical description versus narrative construction? It's like, well, it's always a choice.
Yeah.
We don't have to answer this now. We do have to answer this before we submit the IRB approval, because they need the hits. And so I had this sort of larger question. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just breathing. It was a thoughtful inhale.
And it does relate to, you know, part of this, you know, because of the mechanisms of MTurk, I don't want to waste people's time. I want to be clear, you know, and there's also part of me, it's like, you know, well, I also want more stuff, you know, as a researcher, I just want more stuff. It's like, well, asking about the distinctions between those 3 things, maybe there is something there that you're not anticipating, but you won't know that if you don't look for it. If you don't do it, I guarantee what you're going to find, which is nothing, because you're not looking for it, right?
Yeah. Then maybe we go with the, I mean, if it strikes me that really we're thinking through the question of base unit. And if that's what we're shifting to really acknowledge that it's the hit, then I'm not sure we then need to change anything about the hits that we're requesting.
Why?
Because we're still interested potentially in, well, now, how does the hit potentially differentiate between readability, relevancy, and accuracy.
Is there a sense in which, if we're looking at the hit, the particular hit in our case is not arbitrary, but less important? Because if what you're looking at is hits, it's like, well, this is a hit. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so any hit at some point would then become informative if you're looking at hits.
Right. Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I don't, which may not actually answer the question, right? Well, I don't think it matters actually, but I think it gives us enough nuance to either that nuance is going to be there or it isn't there.
Yeah.
And that will be a result.
Yeah.
Because what we might learn is, well, in the aggregate, the hit doesn't seem to parse these three things.
Right.
And that's something.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not too worried about like getting material to talk about, because if you think about it, the way that this is structured, there's all kinds of different things. So for example, like if we wanted to, we could start looking at statistical stuff. Like, so, we're asking in that first round in two different ways for people to provide summaries. And then we can start to see, okay, so in the second round, when people picked the most, A, B, or C, relevant or readable or whatever, which one came from where, and how, in the people who got selected, how did they rate the clarity and compensation? I mean, numerically, if you actually look at the data streams we'll get out of this, there's a lot that you could do where it's like, I'm not worried about getting back data. It's going to be picking which stream do you want to talk about, just because there's so many possible permutations of how did people rate the compensation and fairness in, the ones who got picked versus the ones who didn't, who got lower score. I mean, it's like, again, we could set up multiple tiers and say, it's like, there's all kinds of stuff that could be done, even from the simple stuff we're asking, that I'm not too worried about getting fodder back. It was just this sort of existential panic of, yeah, I mean, it's like, am I asking them to do something that makes sense for the kind of thing I want to talk about,
Yeah.
And also,
yeah.
Not to cut you off here, but in reading the first piece, when we get to the discussion and it talks about this notion of telling being important, and which is a notion of visibility, and it comes up in stuff like trauma, right? Telling the narrative of cancer, right? And it's like, so part of me was like, well, should these hits we're asking them, should it be more explicitly tapped into this notion of telling? But at the same time, in reading the first piece, I was like, I don't want to be asking people about their trauma. I do not want to be asking them about being cancer survivors. I don't want to, even if that came out in the first piece, it's like, I don't want to ask about all these permutations of telling for other reasons. What I am comfortable talking about is readability, because it's a rhetoric concern. What I don't want to ask them is, tell me about your cancer survival,
Oh.
That was part of it, just sort of like a methodological justification. Why are you asking about this and not that? I was like, because I don't want to ask about that.
I don't want to go there. Yeah, telling is a fully affective form of sensibility, and therefore I don't want to get into it. So I wonder if this is an answer, right? That in many ways, I think the question that you're asking, your existential terror, is really about working with the data we get and not about the hit that we compose.
Yes, although aren't those going to be linked? Isn't the information you get back, I mean, you're getting nails if you've got a hammer.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think they give us enough. We're going to get a sense of how Turkers on a whole feel about the hits.
I don't know. I don't know if what we're getting is how they feel about the hits. I think we're getting what the hit does. I think we don't want to look.
No, that's a good point. Yeah,
You
yeah,
know
yeah.
what I mean? It's a fine distinction, but I think it's important because it's the difference between like sociology and possibly rhetoric, which is I don't really know, and I'm not super interested in how they feel about this too much exactly, even though I'm asking that question. What I'm asking is, what does the hit do?
So is that a question I mean, do we want to now? I mean, it strikes me that a fairly viable and attractive option is we just remove the questions about compensation and clarity of, or
Well, but those are mechanisms of the hit. If you take it outside of how do you feel about this, but put it in terms of this compensation level produces this result. Think of it as a black box. This is the input, and this is the output that spits out on the other end.
because no, and it's good to ask that then, because that's part of the, I mean, this gets back to the whole qualminess of it, is that the base unit is the human intelligence task, but that human intelligence, that task scape of the hit is a labor market. And so it's you'll get human intelligence if you pay it well enough. So in that sense, whether or not something is readable depends on how much you're willing to pay to get it read.
Right. Yeah.
Sense in which we've been looking at legibility and readability, right? There's the kind of mechanical legibility, right? Can you actually parse the marks on the page?
Mm-hmm.
And then readability in terms of the cognitive aspect of it. But we've missed one, which is the economic, right? Oh, I can make sense of it. I can read the characters, but you've not paid me enough for me to summarize this for you.
Or the why, right? If we think of that as a broader question of impetus, right? Again, a rhetorical issue of, yes, I can decrypt and I can think, but why would I do this without a prompt, without an exigence?
Yeah.
Let me jot this down. I mean, if we put that in terms of like exigence, the why of what's making me do this, and that's not a binary, it may be a spectrum of how much why are you inducing in me?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to, I mean, this may be a limb, but right, it's a reminder that, you know, when they've done studies of grocery stores, and right, why is it candy at the checkout aisle? And right, well, one of them is you're at your most vulnerable then, but one of the reasons that you're vulnerable is you have been making decisions in the grocery store, and thinking about what to buy literally burns calories. The intellection is a resource intensive activity. So when we start talking about something like intelligence, you can't ignore the fact that intelligence costs somebody something. So in a certain sense, why should I bother thinking about this? Because that's not free in that sense. I mean, I think it gets to your why, right? That human intelligence isn't this sort of free abstract process. It is linked to legibility in terms of mechanics and legibility, but also exigence and motivation.
Well, and on the labor market of Turk, it's resource also in terms of time. Making me read instructions is a time sink that I could deploy in other places. So here's a sticky question then, and this was in our original design, but it fell out of the current design for particular reasons. And so I don't know if we need to revisit it or not. If we're asking about questions of exigence and prompt, do we need to pay differently for different hits? Wouldn't that address that question of, if you ask the same thing at a level of 50 cents or $1 or $2, right? And then see what you get back. Wouldn't that better address that?
Yeah, you've not paid enough for intelligence yet.
But we wouldn't be able to answer that if we're just paying $1 for everything.
Yeah. Well, then how would we then, I mean, that then becomes a kind of logistical problem. Would we,
It becomes a nightmare.
what?
It becomes a nightmare because every time you multiply, it's like we're not adding 3, you're multiplying 3 across everything else you're doing. So the versions start to just explode.
And we couldn't post them at the same time, could we? Because then it would just be everybody would pick the one that pays more.
That's a weird question.
We'd have to sequence them so that the cheap version was the only version available at a given time.
At least that would be our methodological explication, right? Because you could post them all at once, but would that do something where it's like you get different populations for all 3? You know, you get the ones that are priced higher, you get people who probably are much more experienced and savvy and are going to see that task before newbies because they'll have a lot, you know? So, I mean, would you get better, you know, I don't know. I think you could go either way.
Of course, in that sense, though, again, that's not a problem for us.
It's a result.
Because if we're interested in the hit as the base unit, the difference between a noob and an experienced Turker is meaningless to me. Because if I mean, there's a certain sense in which we also can't go wrong, because no matter what we do, what we get will be, here's how I hit, parse your hit.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like you're going to get results. So it's really a question of what are we asking, you know? And so like if we wanted to do something like stagger payment tiers, which again was in the original and fell away, then maybe what we do, it fell away in part because I think it became logistically very difficult if you're looking at those 3 different terms, because then you have to do things like offer, like right now we've got 8 versions of the survey at the first round because you've got 4 different pieces of media and 2 different titles and descriptions, right? You got 8 there. The second round, you have 12 versions because you've got 4 different pieces of media and 3 different terms, right? So imagine adding on top of that 3 different compensation levels at each level. Now you've got 24 in the first round. And also your pay, you know, we don't have infinite money. And you've got, 36 versions, right? So it's like if you just stack payment tiers on top of this, it becomes a logistical nightmare and we may not be able to afford it. So that then raises the question of, well, if what you're really interested in is like the differences of description and payment tier, then
we don't need the difference between relevance, readability, and accuracy.
No, it'd be nice, but it's also impossible. It'd be a big deal, you know? So it's like, well, then what you do is you streamline it to do, maybe you retain the 2 different titles and descriptions, but say 3 different compensation levels, which now that gives you what, 24. Maybe those 2 different compensation levels drop away. Maybe you don't have 4 pieces of media, right? Maybe you tinker with that a little bit, right? Maybe we don't need 4 different ones. Maybe you just need 2 or something like that. I don't know. You tinker with that. And then maybe in the second round, all you're doing, like if in the first round you asked, produce a readable summary. And then in the second round, all you're asking is select which of these is the most readable, you know?
Yeah.
2 questions potentially.
No, because right, if we do think, and it seems we're making a persuasive case, at least to ourselves, that various compensation level is a part of what makes a hit a hit, then, and if we're trying to keep it manageable for any number of good reasons, then it strikes me that where we then tweak it is just go with readability and jettison accuracy and relevance, and then maybe drop one of the media or 2 of them.
Which one would you drop if you dropped a medium? I mean, the text is the odd duck, but it's also one I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the the picture and the text. Although I do like, yeah, that's something to think about.
Well, hold on, because we might just look at the amount of money we have and just look, because we may not need to. I mean, we may be able to retain the 4 media. If you retain the differences in titles and descriptions, that makes 8 versions. If you had 3 different compensation levels, although you could parse that to 2 or something. And another thing is, you'd want to make sure each one is at least base fair, right? You wouldn't want one that is afoul of ethical compensation guidelines for research. So you start with the minimum, and then maybe you have 2 gradations above that. I don't know. Yeah,
It strikes me is a good. Three compensation tiers as just 2.
If you have, so that would be 24 versions. If you're asking, you couldn't ask for 100 at that juncture. You'd run out of money immediately. There were.
Yeah, dude, I like this. Is like, so what? Explain your methodology. Well, this is how much money we had.
It's relevant.
That's not. I don't think that's tangential to the project.
No.
Hits to generate human intelligence. You have to ante up, and and here's how much we could ante up, and that's.
I should ask for more money. Let's think here. 10, what, 240. You double that, you get 20. You're talking. That's not terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can make the numbers work, but I mean, maybe it's something to look at, is parsing that up, and then on that second one, just the one permutation. Then the only divisions would be the type of media. You'd reduce to 4 versions on the back end.
Ooh. Remember later, I just got an email about a small research projects fund. So
can you get it immediately?
It looks like it. Let's see. I guess it depends when this is a reminder. I must have missed it. That it's due March 1st. So I assume it's happening quickly.
That's like a couple days.
I know. So typical awards vary between $500 and $1,000. So that could get us 100 more hits.
Well, and let's think about this. Boop, boop, ba-doop.
So anyway, reminder, email me the thing that you submitted to get money.
What do you mean, my grant proposal?
Yeah.
Okay. Although some things have changed.
I like the more technical term of that thing you sent in to get money.
Well, I didn't know if you meant that or the IRB justification, or yeah, which wouldn't be, because I'm thinking about this like in terms of IRB.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like, would you hold off until you had a decision, or would you file the IRB? Because in part, like, I have to spend my grant money at a particular time. And then just file an amended IRB. If you got money, we could say, well, we're going to use it to do more hits on that second round. That probably wouldn't be a big, you can file amended IRBs and say, oh, we have more money. We're just going to do more of this.
Oh, I passed my IRB training. I know.
Yeah.
I printed off the certificate.
I'm a doctor too.
I mean, it probably doesn't hurt to ask for money. But there's also too, I mean, the other question is whether we can afford it or not. It's just logistically, do we want, even if we could afford it, would we?
Yeah. Well, I might take a look at tinkering with the hits. Geez, we didn't even look at the language. Well, we can.
And we're at an hour and 20 minutes too.
I know. Well, that's why I texted you and said this may take longer than the once a fortnight thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is good. This is good stuff.
Yeah.
Because I'd rather keep as much of the media as possible than the three different terms. But I don't. But only because I'm having a hard time thinking about if we went from like 4 to 2, which ones would we
Yeah.
pick? And I think there's good. I think that could be a potentially interesting comparisons across those.
Yes. Well, and that's potentially also the argument for keeping the two different versions of titles and descriptions, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, yeah, because we're getting a little bit longer here. I might tinker with the hits, and then it would require a bit of reworking of the IRB because part of what you're doing is those multiple compensation levels, but at different rates. And that might, we'll see, because that might introduce some element of, if you're compensating at different levels, then does that change the risk calculus in any way, even if it's negligible? But it is, if you're asking people to do the same thing, but at different rates, even if the rate is baseline fair, it's like, yeah, but there are winners and losers in a certain way there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okie doke. Well, I don't know. Why don't we tinker with these? I don't know how much we're gonna do right now, on cam.
Yeah. So let's tweak those. Send me your grant, and then I'll submit it Monday, or
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm gonna take a look at the hits and ways to parse up. Yeah, and yet part of me also, I feel keenly, that question of different compensation, is that messing with the Turkers too much? Do you know what I mean? I mean, even if the compensation is fair, is there a sense in which you're kind of screwing with them a little too much?
boy, I mean, I think that's part of why we also
Changed it.
that. Yeah. But I mean, I think I mean, yeah. But that's also how it works.
Well, and in its current structure, there are two different compensation levels, but it's two different tasks, right? The first, you get more for writing than for selecting in the second round.
Yeah.
So there are different compensation levels, but it's the task has been changed, which isn't necessarily it's not an apples to apples comparison. I mean, there's even a sense in which it goes through IRB, but it still may not be totally cool with what what you're doing on the platform. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's kind of parts of these kinds of things is like, like that marshmallow experiment. It's like, yeah, some people are going to get one marshmallow, some people are going to get two. Although that you have agency though.
That's not everybody could get.
Yeah, that's not the same. But surely there have been things where some people get something good and some people do not, and then they see, again, this kind of speaks to treating them as subjects versus, people who are just doing a job.
Yeah.
I guess there are
like, yeah, no, stop worrying about us. I don't know. That could be, yeah. I read that piece in the most self-serving possible way, but it strikes me that they'd be very annoyed by this whole conversation.
Yeah.
And if IRB gives it the go-ahead, then are we being too precious in our?
Yeah.
And again, right, that because they wouldn't necessarily. If we, let's say we stagger them, and someone does the cheap one, and then a week later the higher paying one comes out, they could do that one too, right?
That's true. The way it's set up, the way it's going to be set up, you can only do one of each version because you don't want the same person writing all of them. But the same person can do every version. They would have equal crack at all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be something to write down. There wouldn't. Yeah. Everybody would have a crack.
Like doing the one that's 50 cents doesn't preclude you from then doing the one that's $1.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the way out. And that'd be something we definitely want to put in the IRB, saying we're conscious of that, but because every person can do, you can only do it once, but you can do every version, which means you could do them all. Therefore, you're not getting cheated out of compensation. Yeah.
Get all the marshmallows you want.
Yeah. That's also assuaging some of my preemptive fears about Turkers who might feel like, hey, I only got to do the 50 cents one. It's like, no, you can do them all. You can do whatever you want here.
Yeah. And assuaging it without giving them the, neoliberal garbage answer of, hey, you chose.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a better answer of, oh, you can do that one too, if you want.
Yeah, sure. Go for it, bro.
Stopping you.
Yeah.
That might also, shoot, what was I thinking of here? Well, no, because we wouldn't do, because, part of the thing, as we saw in that piece, is recurrent relationships between requester and Turker. If they're staggered, there's the potential for, the idea that they've done this before. It's a good hit, right? That you're fairly compensated. They don't waste your time and it's clear, that kind of thing. If they're staggered, there's the potential for that kind of thing. Now, we wouldn't be able really to track that because by intent, these are anonymous, where it's not like you could necessarily, say, well, this person thought it was fair and they were someone who did multiple hits, because by intent, we are not tracking them. We're not giving them, numbers to say, oh, people who did all of them rated the compensation more fair, which also sort of like, big surprise. Well, but anywho. Okie doke. All right. Well.
Yeah. No, but I think this is, yeah, I think that just continually re-asking the question, what is it that we're actually hoping to learn is, at some point we'll have to pull the trigger, but.
Yes. See, that's the thing, is at some point this has to be, and that point is soon. That has to be firm so we could submit it to the IRB. That has to go through approval. And then, because, the money is also on a timeline too. So.
Yeah. When is that? Is it the end of April?
Yes. Well, it just says April. Does that mean by April or at the end of April? And even then they were like, you can stretch it, but you'd need to talk to us about it.
Okay.
But, it's not, we don't want things to just float.
Okay. Yeah, and this one doesn't appear to have a deadline.
And also same time revisions on that first one, which I wrote that first revision, or the for the intro. I wrote the kind of first part of the revisions.
Oh yeah,
I was kind of handing it off to you because you had put some notes there about
yeah.
something you wanted to work in.
Well, and I was also jumped back into my head about the thing I was thinking about, this sort of Turker thing, right? Is that it's that Jim Brown's notion of arguing about, with, and in software. It's that in software thing that I think we've confronted a little bit today, right? That you can't think about Turker without you're in mturk to do it, and that constrains you in lots of ways about whatever ethics we might want to bring to the table. We can't simply plug that into mturks. It's got its own procedural ethics built into the network itself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and if we do shift the hit, I would have to rewrite. Yeah, because there are lots of parts that ask about the three different things. Yeah, so everything has ripple effects.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right, so I'll tinker with the hits, and I'll send you that. I need to send you the proposal that I had used.
Yeah, they just need a one-page description. The sense I get is that because of COVID, actually, a lot of these funds the bar is a little lower because a lot of people are just checked out. So,
I think because travel has been utterly curtailed. And so there are all these like travel funds that, if possible, can be used in other ways. I mean, a lot of times, funds are dedicated. Yeah, we're a state agency, so it's like you don't just have a big pot of money. It's like some things are line itemed and that kind of stuff. But sometimes it's like, no, this is for travel and other departmental use. So bloop.
Yeah, no, and this is the benefit of being in the humanities. Most of the people that I'm going to compete against, they only ask for money to travel.
Yeah.
So they can go to archives, right? They don't, unless it's a stipend they want. There's not a lot of ways they could spend money other than traveling to an archive or something like that. So.
Not a lot of research, that needs research backing. Don't need to buy special equipment often. You don't need to do this kind of thing where you're paying research subjects.
Okay, well, send me that. Yeah, and then I will get back into looking at our last interview for this search is Monday. So next week should be a little more manageable. Yeah. So,
yeah.
Okay, later.
Right. Yep, I'll see you.